I mean, we have about 16 other presenters in the next session, so it's hard to do this for every single presenter. All right, so his deck is in the folder now. That's him right there.
So can you just put an one underscore?
Do you have the RTMP stream key that you need?
He will be the first presenter. So,
Yeah. I mean, that's already set up to stream right there. Yeah, it's already loaded up.
so we have another speaker who wants their PowerPoint instead of PDF.
I mean, yeah, it's a matter of how much time we have. I mean, this just to do this right now is whatever 7 minutes or something. So.
Do you know if your colleague, you can ping? It seems that he will try to send the.
Okay, yeah. I mean, he's loading and trying to load the presentations on the other computers now too. Like I said, each room has like 6 presentations right now, and we have 3 minutes until
If we don't have time, no, I
So.
totally get it.
All right, so his is ready to go. Yeah, Eric is number 1, so that replaces
Eric,
that one.
Okay, yours will be open.
Oh, he got the PowerPoint?
Yeah, so it's
nice.
Do you want to play a bit, Reed?
So there, that's ready to go.
You have everything.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Yeah, if you want
Did you get it fancy and TED Talk?
Hey, hello. If you are a presenter, a speaker to this session, can you come and say hi to me? Thanks.
Can I just
Yeah, go. Yeah. Go ahead.
all right.
Yeah, we chat afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, he got mine on there.
Let me see if I can use these. Today is gonna be interesting. Everything I cannot do.
It's gonna be.
All right. Yeah. That's an old slide, so it's fine.
Oh, this is your one.
Yeah. It's all you.
I love that acronym.
The weird. Eric. Is this one or?
What?
Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. So there will be this folder.
Yeah.
And your slides, if you are the last, so it depends on the order. I will.
I don't know which one I am. Do you know which one you are?
Yeah,
I'm third.
Oh, so then I'll be the 4th one.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine.
You are the 4th one, yeah.
Easy.
Are we allowed to just like open the file and just make sure it's the right one?
Yeah, you can.
Cool.
We should actually start
To me.
getting going.
Do you want to check yours?
Yes, please.
You're in a nice little area.
Oh, God.
Do you have make sure your things are set up. So the challenge has been that people are trying to get PowerPoints on there so they can get to their notes, but it's been all PDFs. So make sure if you want your notes, you need to get a PDF of this.
I did a PowerPoint.
A PowerPoint?
So I'm
Well, make sure it's a PowerPoint on it.
Wait, is my paper supposed to be one of these?
Oh, it'll be in the file.
No, it's a folder.
Gotcha.
You are,
I think I'm. Congratulations on best paper. Okay. I'm gonna give you a hug in a minute. Yeah.
So you are.
Oh, it's this one. Okay. Is there any chance I could open up a
PowerPoint?
Google presentation? No.
It's. I think there were some instructions where people are saying by some date, and we.
No, I did. I
already
sent
know.
this.
Oh, you sent the PDF. Yeah. But
Yeah, there was no other option to send anything else.
PowerPoint.
Well, okay.
And
Okay.
I have not made. I found out.
No worries. I'm not blaming you. I'm sorry.
I was just
Mostly-
holding while looking.
Mostly, I am just going to probably. I'm gonna have to.
Remember the speaker notes.
No, I'm gonna have to open them. That's the only option for me. So I'll probably open it up next to it or something.
Oh, that one.
Yeah. I'll have it in front of me. I'll press both buttons at the same time. It's the only thing that's gonna work for me. So that's fine.
Yeah. I mean, we tried. Eric sent downloaded the Google slides as PowerPoint, and then
Oh, okay. And then that came up with speaker notes.
yeah.
Let me get this guy's
We are already
presentation on here.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to get this other guy's presentation on here now. He's paper 82. Okay.
Hi everyone. We will start in 30 seconds or so.
All right, so that last guy is paper 82. That's his PowerPoint there. So let's just go to the first one right now okay.
Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to this one of the first sessions at FACT on self-reflection. We have 5 very interesting presentations today. So we will start with Eric, who will talk about, who will encourage us to take a step back and reflect on how we as a community conceptualize transparency. Or in other words, what do we mean when we talk about transparency? And the paper also asks us to reconsider centering transparency as part of our core goals and values. And with this, I'm letting Eric take the floor.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Eric Corbett. My co-author and colleagues, Emily Denton. We're both researchers at Google in the Technology, AI, Society, and Culture team. So the title of this paper, Interrogating the T in Fact, is a critical investigation of the ways in which FACT has engaged the concept of transparency, as well as how we might think about this concept of transparency moving forward. So as we all know, since its establishment in 2018, the FACT has become the flagship community for academic scholarship on algorithmic systems. What makes FACT distinct is this title is composed of a trinity of concepts, as we know, fairness, accountability, and transparency. And these 3 concepts guide, right, the focus and objective of this community. But of course, in order to use these concepts to interrogate AI, right, we have to interrogate what they mean to us and also how we are using these concepts in our work. And so, curiously enough, these first 2, fairness and accountability, have been giving a lot of attention and interrogation. Right, so we explore what does fairness mean, what does accountability mean, how are we doing it, how are we not doing it. But for some reason, transparency has managed to lurk sort of in the background. It's a transparent concept. We kind of end up looking right through it, but never actually at it. So that's an interesting thing. So As of now, we actually do not know what that concept means in this community, how we're using it, or how we should be using it. And so this paper is a conversation about that. So, so specifically what we ended up doing in the paper is a literature review. We found 26 papers in the last 4 years of fact scholarship that have engaged the concept of transparency. And we asked these 4 questions about transparency. What exactly is being made transparent in the paper? So for instance, is it an algorithm? Is it a data set? Why is transparency being pursued? So is transparency being pursued to increase accountability, or is it to make something more fair? How is transparency being done? So specifically, what is the mechanism? Is it an interface explanation? Is it a model card? So what is the exact how of transparency? And then who? So who is providing and receiving the transparency? Is it a corporation providing transparency to end users, or is it a government providing transparency to general broader publics? So these are the 4 questions we asked as we were doing the literature review of the papers, and we found 26 papers. And what I'm going to do is just show you a high level of what we found when we asked those 4 questions. So, in terms of what, we found that most of the papers are focusing on technical aspects of ML systems or organizational factors, but few are looking at both at the same time, in which you might call a socio-technical approach, and that there's some issues in how you can understand transparency if you're not doing both of those at the same time, as you can imagine. In terms of why, so the most common why of transparency is accountability. So if we're doing transparency, chances are it's to make something more accountable. Challenge in the papers is that most of the papers end up presuming transparency can have a positive effect on accountability without actually evaluating it. So it allows ineffective transparency mechanisms to sort of slide through. How? So there is a vast over-focus on model explainability as the method of doing transparency. And there's a tendency to conflate explainability with transparency. And so I'll return to that later in the talk. And in terms of who, the recipients are end users, or imagined to be end users, and the providers are most of the time technical experts. So folks like us, or government researchers, and even though the end users are the most referenced recipient of transparency, there's very few actually end user studies around how people actually are able to use or not use the transparency being provided. So, you know, this is the what, why, how, and who of transparency, and we go into much more detail in the paper. But for now, what I want to do is just point out some of the broader assumptions about transparency that these findings end up speaking to. And so these are 3 common presumptions of transparency precipitated in the current work. First is that transparency works. So transparency is an effective and useful means to making AI systems more fair and accountable. Transparency is good. It's a normative value that's good for society, and therefore we should be pursuing it as an end in of itself. And that transparency is also a peer. So it's an equal virtue to fairness and accountability, and we should think about all 3 of these things in the same way. So in the paper, we use perspectives from critical transparency scholarship, and so this is an academic discourse that interrogates the norms, beliefs, and expectations of transparency in society to challenge these 3 presumptions. So, for instance, the critical transparency people would argue that, in fact, a lot of times, transparency mechanisms often don't work and can actually be counterproductive to the efforts of those who are providing transparency. They argue that transparency is not always good. So making something more transparent can be good or bad, but there's no inherent moral value in transparency in and of itself. And then finally, they would argue that the way in which we treat transparency as a peer to accountability and fairness, again, implicitly, because transparency is in the trinity of concepts that form this conference's title, is wrong. Transparency is actually not a peer to accountability and fairness. It's a very different concept, and we should not treat it or conflate it as such. And so, on the whole, a current reading of transparency and fact, or the sort of framing of it or lack thereof, currently allows transparency to exist as a magical concept. So where at times the power of transparency appears to lie in its mere utterance, as if it were a magical formula whose meaning doesn't need to be understood for its effects to be felt. And so this creates this sort of a power of transparency, this moral and political capital gained by doing transparency, even when transparency might be ineffective, immoral, or irrelevant, that we need to start thinking more critically about and avoiding. So in order to resist this magic of transparency, in the paper we speculated provocatively, this was an intentional provocation, on whether we might be better suited dropping the T from the title. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pilot a new potential title without the transparency in it. And we can vote now. I have the power to make this change. No, not this one. They probably love this one. This one's going to be the most appropriate because, in fact, again, if you look, fact scholars use the term explainability more often than they do transparency and conflate explainability with the concept of transparency, and these are two very different things. So we can go with this title, probably. No? Ultimately, in the paper, we argued for keeping the T in the title, but only if we adopt critical transparency perspectives to frame how we engage transparency moving forward. And what I'm going to do is give you 3 of these perspectives, okay? The first is that transparency is political. So, politics are present in the process and outcome of transparency. If you think about it, the process of making something transparent is a decision. There is a what should be made transparent. Should is an exercise of judgment and moral authority that we have to keep in mind. So it reminds us that, you know, something doesn't just become transparent from nowhere, and the process of making that thing transparent is really an objective one. So transparency is a fundamentally political concept. It's not a technical concept. It can be, but it has political elements to it. Second, there is no inherent moral value in making something more transparent. Transparency is a morally neutral concept. And last is transparency is about people. People should matter in transparency. The nature of the relationship, structures they're embedded in, and the agency to reveal and act upon what is revealed. So to wrap it all up, moving forward, in fact, in the paper, we provide these 3 tangible things that we should do in our scholarship moving forward. Make transparency contingent. That means we should evaluate transparency to see if it's actually the right thing that needs to be done in a situation and to see if it actually works. We need to reclaim transparency from explainability. Transparency is not explainability. Explainability is a subset of a much broader array of mechanisms we should be exploring to do transparency. Documentation, auditing, AI literacy, data intermediation, art, public engagement. There are all these other different mechanisms to do transparency that are beyond explainability. And then the last is bringing people into transparency processes. So this is using human-centered and participatory approaches to bring people into that political process of revealing and concealing that's at the heart of transparency. And in close, we hope that the thoughts provided in this paper will help this community move towards providing meaningful and actual transparency that can make AI more fair and accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Eric. So I'm going to quickly remind everyone, so the structure of the session is we have the talks back-to-back, each 10 minutes, and then we'll open for questions at the end. So next, it is believed, right, that representation is instrumental to the quality of AI systems and central to achieving fairness, but how does the community conceptualize this representation? And this is what Stevie will talk about next.
I don't think maybe I got it. Here we are. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. Okay, cool. So I don't actually have a clock, but I'm going to do my best here. Okay, cool. You're my clock. And I'm also doing my best because I'm holding my speaker notes right here. Yeah, I need to move it. Better? Yes. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Stevie Bergman. I'm a research scientist on the ethics research team at DeepMind. This work was done alongside my wonderful co-authors, so just to mention them quickly, Lisa Ann Hendricks, Mary Beth Rao, Bashi Wu, William Agnew, Marcus Kunesh, Isabella Duan, Yasin Gabriel, and William Isaac. In this paper, Representation in AI Evaluations, we provide a kind of conceptual scaffolding for a deep understanding of representation for AI, what it means, and AI evaluations in particular, because we argue in the paper that representation requires a goal. And so in order to understand what representation means for AI, you actually need to think about the particular goal of any piece of the system. And so we chose evaluations. And in some ways, this is also a self-reflection, similar to Eric's talk, of how we think about an important concept. So in this short talk, I'm not really going to take a deep dive into anything in particular, rather outline the main topics. Okay, cool. So we might start by asking, what does it mean for an AI system to be representative? But we quickly learn in analyzing this question and maybe even trying to implement something representative or develop guidelines on representation, that the question is too unfocused and ill-defined to be really useful. Like fairness, representation contains many meanings. It's a suitcase word, and it packs a lot in. Yet we all use it all the time in everyday speech without the certainty that we're all discussing the same thing. And when it comes to making our systems more representative, we might have difficulties understanding what that even really means. Or worse, we might actually feel like we know what it means and implement something that is not optimal or really beneficial, especially for marginalized, at-risk, or minoritized groups, those typically underrepresented. It's so important we work this out because, okay, this is, yeah, cool, I'm gonna go. This was meant to be an animation. That's fine. So we still see representativeness called for in news and opinion pieces, literature, guidelines, product aspirations, and proposed policy. We need to pick apart this important concept and understand what kind of representation is good to implement, and perhaps in what conditions or what part of the pipeline and for what goal for AI systems that we all work on. In previous papers that dove deeply into socio-technical historical meanings of representation for AI, the authors Chaslow and Levy stated in their FACT 2021 paper that representation cannot, as a word with meaning, cannot really stand alone, meaning that it needs to have some adjective or something to give it real definition. Without understanding the definition for responsible AI creation and deployment, we will not have the guidance necessary to create robust, effective, and responsible technologies. So if we instead take this kind of vague question, what does it mean for an AI system to be representative, and break it down by component of the AI development pipeline, say including the data sets that are used to train, evaluate, audit, and/or benchmark models, annotators who label data sets or probe models, stakeholders who evaluate the technology, or even a property of the ML designers themselves, then the question becomes much more manageable. Each of these components has a goal. we can consider each stage of development a potential site of exclusion where the meaning of representation needs to be considered. The central question of the work of the paper is how do we think about and practically consider representative evaluation for AI? We primarily focused on evaluation data sets as we developed out these concepts, and as we saw it to be crucial for AI evaluations to be robustly, inclusively representative in order to avoid blind spots in the evaluation of a system, and to avoid representational harms from burdening already marginalized communities. It was kind of the most tangible, direct, and high-priority place to start. So taking a quick step back, why is representation important? We might feel that it is, the way we might feel that transparency is important, but to pick it apart, we can roughly split representation between why is representation instrumentally valuable and why is it intrinsically valuable. So by instrumental, I mean when representation is good because it achieves something, because it makes our AI systems better. It surfaces more blind spots or harms in the model and can lead to a better working system for people. Intrinsic goods are those things we value because they are in and of themselves good things. So for this, we state that the reasons representation is itself a good quality for a system to have. Say because the existence of representation engenders legitimacy or makes it more trustworthy. Or representation is good in and of itself because if our systems are meant to serve people, then they ought to be of the people as well. In this work, we more or less assume intrinsic importance and really dive into instrumentally valuable properties or representative of representative AI evaluations. So we typically talk about evaluation data sets. However, the framework could certainly be extensible beyond that. So, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but we further contend that with limitations or potential problems with only considering instrumental representation for system performance as an end in and of itself. To understand and buttress our intuition around current standard practices, we reviewed a random selection of about 20% of accepted papers from NeurIP's 2022 Datasets and Benchmarking Track. The practices for creating benchmark or evaluation datasets included combining multiple datasets, web scraping en masse, and the non-stratified random sampling of a pre-existing population of data. Uniform or random sampling is useful for inference, for example, political polling. However, it's not necessarily the right practice for effective AI evaluation. The concern is that metrics will be dominated by majority groups and may not accurately reflect the model's performance for minority groups. This kind of dominance is very clearly shown in this figure from the paper, Does Object Recognition Work for Everyone? And we actually have a lot more examples of past work that shows this kind of issue. So in this image is the distribution of the origin of images in 3 large data sets circa 2018 versus the world population on the bottom right. So you can see that large swaths of the world do not have a significant number of images in ImageNet, COCO, or Open Images, at least at the time when this paper was ran. To walk through what better looks like, we consider the questions of representative of who and representative of what. In other words, we look at practices to increase representation by simply sampling by group and how these groups were chosen. Then we looked at methods to sample by systematically building out coverage of a domain of application. We naturally notice this tension between having a less clear or scoped application and being able to define clearly what representation and coverage of the space should look like. We try and bring the reader along as we discuss these methods that lead to more representation by discussing a couple of examples, a relatively simple example of street sign recognition and a Portuguese hate speech example. And we ask, what should representation look like in these cases, pulling in good practices from the literature. Then we combine these methods for filling out representation per group and by domain of application into a framework for thinking about what good representation in evaluation data sets should look like. We ended up calling it subject domain representation. It's kind of a mouthful. But what we were thinking of with this representation is that when the data set or evaluation is constructed such that it is inclusive of the diversity of events of who or whose situations are being modeled, typically data subjects. With this in mind, given that the practitioner identifies the groups or data subjects their system should function well for, and has scoped the domain in which the system should be performant, the practitioner's next challenge is to sample for each group such that the group subsets are representative of the events which they are seeking to model. It's a mouthful. But what's really important is to directly consider the different manners in which groups could express in a domain. In some ways, this could feel obvious. However, it is deeply important to state cogently so that it can be operationalized and advocated for. Or when representation is called for in evaluation or stated as a property of an evaluation, it can be interrogated. So this also struck me this morning in the thick alignment talk by Alondra Nelson, that essentially what this kind of work is calling for is a thicker dive into what representation really means for data sets. So the last thing we argue is that if you don't directly contend with what groups are represented and in what specific domain, those decisions have in fact already been made and can be inferred based on, say, the evaluation itself and analyzing it. They just haven't been made deliberately. So I'll just have a couple quick slides. So we then turn to the limits of representation. For example, when not everything can or should be represented, such as for qualities that exist on a spectrum or are fundamentally fluid, and that full representation, as with full fairness, is likely impossible or totally infeasible. We dive into each of these in greater depth in the paper. And then we do a call for much more research in this area, for example, these questions. Thank you very much. Feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Stevie. Leah? So the next paper will map the landscape of ethical disclosure practices in predictive mental health research, particularly when that research relies on social media data. And I will let Leah take the stage.
Hi everyone, my name is Leah. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and today I'll be presenting on our systematic literature review of ethics disclosures in predictive mental health research. This work was done in collaboration with researchers at Georgetown, CU Boulder, Marquette, and Georgia Tech. We're very grateful to everyone who made this research possible. Also, a brief content warning, our presentation will discuss mental illness and suicidality. Please feel free to leave the room at any point or skip this presentation altogether if it's not going to serve you on your journey. Particularly in the United States, mental illness is at an all-time high. Yet, treatment is inaccessible to the point where it can take nearly a decade for someone to experience symptoms to getting the help they need. The problem is even worse in teens, and in some cases is a matter of life or death. Therefore, it is crucial we find non-invasive ways to promote support-seeking and treatment-seeking behaviors from those experiencing mental illness. To that end, there's over a decade of research on predicting mental health states from social media data. While these methods are non-invasive compared to traditional diagnostic options, this is ripe with ethical nuance. We're using sensitive data from potentially vulnerable populations who may not be informed on how their data is being used. In our work, we take the stance that predictive mental health research must be ethical. Not only does research ground product and innovation, but this is also a matter of human well-being. To quote W.E.B. Du Bois, decisions fall into the realm of ethics when they pertain to things within our control that can show respect to human being. Mental health is the human condition, and we as researchers have the ability to make decisions about how we're predicting it and how we're using social media data. To address this issue, we ask, what is the landscape of ethics in predictive mental health research, particularly when we're using social media data? Note that a lack of self-reflection of ethics in predictive mental health can lead to serious consequences. We could cause harm to users, such as de-anonymizing mental health diagnoses or misusing their data to the point where we're communicating misdiagnoses. We could inadvertently propagate unethical practices and not realize it until it's too late to make meaningful change. And we could also perpetuate the ought-is gap, this notorious space in research that is the space between what we should be doing and what is, that problem of bringing ethical norms into practice in research. We operationalize ethics as disclosures in archived research papers. So this is any mention of decision-making that relates to ethics, potential harms, or broader impacts. As you can see from this quote from a paper in our data set, we note 3 different ethics disclosures here. 1, the authors note that they did not seek IRB approval. 2, they note that they used public data. And 3, they note that they had no interaction with users. Our dataset consisted of 129 archived research papers that use machine learning techniques to predict a mental health state from social media data. This is an expansion of the Chancellor and DeChowdhury corpus of an original 79 papers. As you can see from the figure on our right, we have publications distributed from 2013 to 2022. We then landed on 13 different ethics practices that you can see on my left here, categorized into 3 different categories: human subjects, data-centered, and impact. We reached this final rubric by coding papers and then updating concepts until we reached saturation. We then applied this rubric to all 129 papers, coding yes or no if there was a disclosure present anywhere in the paper, memoing for qualitative analysis, and then receiving consultation from our non-coding experts, Casey Fiesler, Michael Zimmer, and Moonmoon DeChowdhury. This table represents 13 of our ethics disclosures, along with the percentage of papers in our data set that disclosed that item. Promisingly, 96% of papers disclose subject inclusion or exclusion criteria. However, less than 8% disclose any plan to inform subjects, moderators, or gatekeepers. Note that we coded for a disclosure, so a mention of a practice, rather than any explicit engagement with it. So even papers that explicitly noted they had no plan to inform moderators, we considered that as a disclosure. When we look at the disclosures that were most prominent in our data set, we find that they often fall under methodological concerns. We call this doing double disclosure duty because it gives the researcher insights into methods replicability and an ability to build off of those methods. However, it also gives us insights into the potential harms and risks of this research. This is promising because it shows that there are some standards in how we disclose, just those fall under methodological reasons rather than human-centered ones. To move on to another finding, we ask, do practices improve over time? So we look at disclosure density on the y-axis of this plot, the average percentage of disclosures out of our 13 rubric items in a paper. We plot this disclosure density and the average as that bold green line, and then we extrapolate it out using the year-over-year rate of change. You can see that in the hyphenated green line. We see that promisingly our community is improving. However, the organic rate of change is extremely slow. At this disclosure rate, it will take us 8 years to reach 75% disclosure density. That means it'll be until 2031 where an average predictive mental health paper is disclosing 75% of our rubric items. To put that into context, 8 years ago was 2015. That was still before the first ever Fat Star conference. We have an extreme sense of urgency here to catalyze this growth that we're organically seeing because we cannot afford these current trends. We also did some qualitative analysis and found that arguments propagate through papers. We call these sticky practices because they've stuck over time. So for example, many researchers used secondary data sets and disclosed ethics by pointing back to those data sets rather than making contextual notes about how that data is used in their specific work. We also find problematic arguments about consent being propagated over the years in our data set. Arguments that asking users to participate in their research could be coercive. Note that this is antithetical to what is widely accepted, that consent is an anti-coercion measure that gives users autonomy and agency. This argument first appeared in 2015 and then was used in multiple papers after from 2019 to 2022. These sticky practices are evidence of implicit norms, unwritten rules that are adopted through peer usage. Now, implicit norms are not necessarily bad. They're a low-resource way of getting people to do things. However, they're extremely risky. We can't critique or deliberate or discuss implicit norms because they fly under the radar. Our findings imply that there is no common way of disclosing ethical decision-making in predictive mental health research. This is alarming because we cannot afford the status quo. Recall that this, in some cases, is a matter of life or death. This is suicidality at play here. And we also find that papers propagate practice. This is important for us as researchers because it means we need to be intentional about what we're choosing to include in the papers that we write. We also include pragmatic suggestions based on our findings. First, we suggest an increase in open and interdisciplinary conversations. While we mainly looked at computational work in mental health, we suggest incorporating more mental health experts, clinicians, and ethicists into these conversations, giving us a holistic understanding of what ethics standards should be in this space. We also suggest venues allow for dedicated space in papers for ethics reasoning. This means authors don't have to be judicious about what they're disclosing. They can do that ethics reasoning in their papers. Moreover, it allows ethics to be part of the discussion during the peer review process. We can hold researchers accountable to bringing about the standards that we want. And finally, we suggest more context documents or context exercises to increase transparency. Thinking about ethics is really hard. It's nuanced. And so there should be things like these exercises that can help scaffold researchers and accompany papers to help readers make sense of what is going on. To unpack that, we invite you as you leave this room to think more about how you engage with ethics in your own work. How would you go about disseminating that or discussing that with your peers? Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. You can find a PDF of the paper at my personal website, leahajmani.com. And I'd love to answer any questions after the last talk or outside after the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. So for the next talk, we will hear how the ethical requirements and norms have changed when it comes to data creation or data augmentation. And we'll speak about this next.
Cool. Thank you so much. Awesome. Hi. My name is Will Hawkins. I am from DeepMind. This work, though, was done at the Oxford Internet Institute with my wonderful collaborator, Brent Mittelstadt. I'm very excited to talk to you today about data enrichment, which is a topic which has been very prominent across the fact community. And in this piece of work, what we did was look at how data enrichment ethics was discussed in AI research, so at different venues, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Cool, so what we will do, first of all, we'll give a bit of background about research ethics and how crowdsourcing and AI have been getting very, very closely intertwined. Then we'll share our method that we used and then talk through a few results and key findings. Note, I don't think I have animation, so some of the slides are going to be very dense. We'll get there. We'll deal with that problem when we get there. So, background, where have we been coming from? When we first started this work, we did most of what we were considering or thinking about was what is research ethics and how does it relate to crowd work? Now, what you can see on screen is a very, very broad definition of the idea of research ethics, the rules and guidelines governing the ethical conduct of scientific research, but there's a big red asterisk because the reality of research ethics is that it isn't, the procedures that at least that we see in institutional review boards or research ethics committees in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom is that research ethics isn't considered in this way. And in fact, there's a very specific definition of research ethics which considers research involving human participants or human subjects. So where people are the subject of research or participating in a research study where the human is the thing that's being studied in most cases. Now that is a really important caveat because what we see in AI research is often humans aren't the subject of the study, and in fact data enrichment workers are contributing to the improvement or change of a model. And that means when we think about how research ethics and crowd work intersect, we see quite confusing things, which we'll talk about. So, crowdsourcing. I will be brief on this, but the concept of crowd work is one where you put a task online, effectively in most cases, and have an open call to ask people to complete the task for you. It's grown very, very popular, as I'm sure people in this room are very familiar with, because of cost, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's been possible for institutions to undertake tasks at a very large scale, paying people very small amounts of money, so it's been very cheap. It's also possible to do this on a massive scale, and it's given institutions access to a wide range of different people, which, to Stevie's talk, can help with representation, which has been an important part of why there's been a shift towards crowdsourcing. You may be familiar with the platform MTurk, Amazon's Mechanical Turk. It is historically the most popular platform for crowd work, but now in the AI community, we see specific platforms like Scale or Surge or Prolific. These have all been growing in the last 2 or 3 years for different use cases. But MTurk was really the leading light originally, where most researchers were going to engage with crowd workers. There's 250,000 people active on MTurk, so this isn't a niche issue by any means. People's livelihoods are very central to these platforms. And the citations and the use of MTurk has massively increased. And this only goes to 2014. I would hazard a guess that there might be an order of magnitude shift between 2014 and now. And in AI, it's been central ever since ImageNet, which was a big piece of work about a decade ago, which involved a huge amount of data labeling of images. And one of the researchers from the ImageNet paper described MTurk as a godsend. Now we see crowd work as pretty much essential to most of the large models that we see being developed across different organizations. And reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, which has been key to big breakthroughs in the last couple of years, utilizes, as you can see in the title, a huge amount of human feedback, which goes to crowd work. So, just thinking about the relationship between AI and crowdsourcing, not all crowd work is the same when it comes to AI research. You can see a taxonomy here of different types of tasks that AI researchers engage in when they are working with crowd workers. This isn't a taxonomy developed by ourselves, but by researchers who are looking at NLP research, and also by the Partnership on AI, who are focusing on this definition of data enrichment. And I'd highly recommend checking out Sonam Jindal's work on data enrichment if you want to read more about that. But generally, AI researchers engage with crowd work for labeling tasks. This might be objective labeling, like labeling an image of whether something is a cat or a dog, but it also could be subjective. So doing things like labeling harmful content can often be a very, very subjective task, which is a different type of task than labeling a picture of a cat or dog. Also, a huge amount of tasks for AI research are related to evaluation, so humans giving opinions on quality, coherence, or some other criteria. Preference data often is in this bucket. Or finally, production, so creation of data. You might want to create data sets using crowd work. But this is all quite different to what we discussed at the start, which is participant research or behavioral research, where humans are the subject of the study. Now, some AI research does involve behavioral studies, and we looked at papers which do this, but it's a little bit separate to data enrichment, which doesn't fall cleanly into the category of human participant research. Okay. There are various ethics challenges of crowd work. You can see them on screen. I'm not going to go through all of them, because I think this is there's lots of literature in this space. But the argument that we make is that the challenges of crowd work are not specific to any one of these categories. In fact, all of these issues are relevant across all of them. So there's no good reason, from our point of view, that you should treat procedurally a human subject study to a data enrichment study, because there are issues of payment in both. There are issues of maltreatment. There are issues of power. There are issues of dehumanization. So where we are today, and what we came into the study thinking, was that AI research increasingly is reliant on human data collection via crowdsourcing platforms. This is a very relevant issue. We know that crowd work raises ethical challenges, And the relationship between AI research and research ethics is unclear because of this different definition of human participant research or behavioral studies and data enrichment. So what we looked at was how does AI research involving crowd workers engage with research ethics, using very similar methods to LEA, which we'll talk about now. So what we did was look at policies from different publication venues. So we picked a couple of large AI conferences, or the most prominent AI conferences, ICLR and NeurIPS. We also looked at journals. So Springer, Nature have a load of AI journals, and we looked at those to see if there was any difference between journals and conferences. And then we looked at the practices. So we went through papers from all of these venues to look at, are people disclosing IRB reviews? Are people disclosing issues of consent, demographics, payment? We looked at a few different things. We compared this to how psychology papers disclose these types of issues, and also a conference called CHI, which is effectively a human-computer interaction conference. And then we compared that back to policy requirements. So the results, the fun bit. On the policy side, it's really only in the last 2 years that we've seen ICLR and NeurIPS get really serious about ethics disclosures and policies on this front. So ICLR have a code of ethics now, which they developed in 2021. There's principles in it like avoiding harm and respecting privacy, but the practical requirements of it is that you have to disclose IRB where appropriate in ICLR papers. So we would expect that any paper that meets the requirement or the definition of a IRB relevant study should disclose that. We should see that in the papers. Similarly, NeurIPS have a checklist which is much more prescriptive and actually asks researchers to do quite a lot of things. So you have to disclose the instructions for participants. You have to disclose IRB review. You should be disclosing any risk to workers. You should be disclosing payment rates per hour. We'll see how that turns out in a moment. And then Springer has an editorial policy across all of their journals. So there's nothing specific to AI, but you should, again, be disclosing IRB. So you can see here that there's pretty consistent disclosure requirements when it comes to IRB, but less so for other issues. So what we see in practice, and this is where the slides aren't particularly visual. So just to talk through a couple of key things here, we're going to take each table one by one, so ignore table 3 and table 4 for the time being. What you see in table 2 are the results from the NeurIPS papers. So in the second column is how many crowdsourcing papers we saw from each year. And then the following columns you see where the IRB review was disclosed, where the payment was disclosed, consent and demographics. What we see is that in 2018, NeurIPS papers almost never disclosed any of these issues. But by the time we saw the requirements put in place that they have now, we see much better disclosures, but still not that strong. So we see 54% of papers disclose payment, but we should see that to be 100%, otherwise the papers shouldn't be accepted in theory. Meanwhile, in ICLR, we see almost no disclosures whatsoever, despite the fact these meet the same criteria. And in Springer, we see better disclosures, but this might be because we see lots of interdisciplinary research. Check this out in the paper if you want to go into more detail here. But a couple of comparisons. So if you look at the bottom 2 lines of table 5, you see comparisons to Springer psychology papers and to CHI, where you can see the disclosures are far higher. One of the reasons why that might be the case is because of the behavioral task versus data enrichment task. So we looked at that in table 7, and still we saw that NeurIPS, ICLR, Springer AI do not disclose at the same level, even when the papers clearly meet the criteria for behavioral research. So this isn't just an issue of the type of task. And again, even if it was an issue of the type of task, the ethical issues are still there, so there's no good reason for that. And then finally, the key things to take away is that papers at leading AI research venues do not align with traditional research ethics disclosure standards. We saw that. We saw that journals and conferences do have the power to influence engagement with research ethics. So NeurIPS have a higher disclosure rate than ICLR, and we think that's probably because of the checklist. And then finally, and maybe the most interesting thing, which I really hope there's more research into, is that there's almost no disclosures around demographic impacts or demographic disclosures in these papers, when we know that RLHF, we know that subjective labeling is going to have impacts depending on what demographics the workers have. So we really want to see more research in this space about why that is and how we improve it. Thank you so much. If you've got any questions, come and chat.
Thank you, Will. So for the final talk in this session, this will be on a topic very close to my heart, data biases, or whose voices are represented in our studies or data sets. And Daniela will talk about that.
All right. So yeah, it's a good self-reflection exercise. In addition to go to therapy, we should ask ourselves how weird we are. Sometimes we do that, all right. And as a conference, we also could ask ourselves how weird we are, and that's going to be the presentation for the next 8 minutes. I'm going to tell you all about the weirdness of this conference. So, in particular, the weirdness related to data sets being studied, right? We know the previous presentation made abundantly clear that there is bias in data sets, and we saw tons of examples in different applications for data sets, and ImageNet was widely cited in this session and possibly in other sessions in this conference. And the authors themselves, so ImageNet, they detail how biased the data set was, despite being the widely used data set in computer vision. Now, the problem is, of course, the answer is that are we weird? Of course, the answer would be yes. Right? But then the question becomes to which extent you can quantify the weirdness, right? And can we quantify to a certain extent these biases? The answer is yes, to a certain extent. And in 2010, Henrich coined the term weird, which stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? So basically, most of, I think that was in the context of psychological research, most of the people, our subject study participants were weird, right? And were undergrads typically from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. And that was a problem for especially for psychology, for the representativeness of the results. So we took that framework and we asked ourselves, well, since fact is still about fairness, accountability, and to a certain extent transparency, we can ask, is there a problem to be weird? Possibly yes, but to which extent fact is weird? We have two research questions, how weird fact is.
The following research questions.
And
the first question
how
is,
fact compares to Chi. And that's my audio, because my collaborator actually had an audio slide, which I didn't purposely remove. So we have this experience of hearing two voices, which the second voice is not inside your head. So the data collection was about fact. Basically, we took from 2018 to 2022. We took 416 papers, and then we went through a manual exclusion criteria, meaning that we removed tutorials, we removed things that were non-human subjects, for example, handwritten notes, like we removed them, and some of the papers that we didn't know what they were studying, so we removed them as well. So we ended up with 128 papers, and as a baseline comparison, just to understand a bit the numbers, we compare with the previous study by Linksen for Chi, where they took more than 1,000 papers in Chi and analyzed with the same kind of framework the weirdness of Chi. Now, what do we mean by weird? By Western, we mean if a country is Western based on Huntington definition. Here, there are some problems with this definition, of course. For example, Japan and South Korea are not considered Western country, despite, for example, being considered highly educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? So there is a bit of definition and banalization in the Western kind of label. But educated, we take the schooling for the country, industrialized, the GDP per capita, then the income per capita, and democratic, the political rights, as per the Freedom House political rights report. So in terms of, once we have this definition of metrics, then we can try to combine these metrics, right? We say, okay, for Western is the expected value that you have for example, if all the subjects come from Western country, then the value is going to be 1, right? Normalized for the population of the country. And for education score, we actually, for example, just imagine that you can rank in a conference all the countries by being studied and all the country by education, right? If this ranking is 1, means that exactly the countries that are highly educated, they are the highly studied countries, right? So this basically correlation goes from -1 to 1. When it's 1, you are actually perfectly aligned with the educated kind of dimensions. And we do that for industrialized, rich, and democratic. So how weird is fact? Worryingly very weird. And 84%, nearly 84% of the papers are exclusively Western countries, and 64 are US. Pause. Then they are quite in the correlation that I said, -1 to 1. They are educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, yes, and to a quite significant extent, right? Now, the interesting part would be how to understand these numbers, and fact is less eared than Chi, just a bit. So if you compare these two numbers between 0.31 and 0.46, for example, Chi tend to, for example, study more educated participants of countries that are more educated than fact. So, but fact is more westernized, right? So, to a certain extent, Chi is less study participants from not necessarily exclusively from Western countries, which is the main problem with fact. And what is the reason? Well, the main reason is that fact, there is an over-reliance on off-the-shelf data sets, meaning big data sets, benchmark data sets, right? They're provided by companies mainly, whereas Chi, they tend to have also studies that are done by the authors, the data is collected by the authors, so tend to be a bit more local, right? And another thing that we observe, especially for Chi, is statistical significance given the sample, is that when authors come from multiple countries, then the papers tend to be less westernized, right? Which points actually to something we could do, right, to fix this situation. So what can we do to fix this situation? Where we can have data statements, as was said before. They are mandatory, a checklist, for example, in the case of UNIPS. We can encourage, hopefully, cross-country authorships, right? Workshops, they are a really good way to meet people from possibly different countries and to diversify a bit that thing. And one thing that we're trying to think about is that whether we can have conferences publish these numbers of weirdness, meaning that in addition of publishing the numbers of papers that they were accepted or rejected or whatever, then it could also say, this year we are on a trend to become less weird compared to previous years. And that's a measure that also lends itself to that consideration. If you're interested in what we're doing next, you can go to social-dynamics.net/weird/platform or scan the QR code. Clearly, we are thinking about a platform where we can actually have crowd workers or even participants in conference to actually score the papers in terms of weirdness and have these numbers being publicly available for the research community. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Daniele. And actually, can you stay there? Perhaps I can ask all the speakers to go on the stage. And we have, I think, a couple of minutes for perhaps one question. Is there anyone from the room who? Let's go.
Pick the best one.
Yeah, this is for the, is working? Yeah, this is for the last speaker. So I worked in Indian academia and then I have been living in the United States. So I would propose to you that while you are describing the symptom, the structural reality under what is happening, I would argue is much more complex than what comes across from your paper. I mean, first of all, you have to be weird even to afford the registration fees for these conferences very often. That right off the bat deals with So what I'm saying is if you sort through those kinds of things, travel costs, registration costs, how much such activity would be encouraged in, so if I was at the Indian Institute of Science, I can assure you that this kind of activity would be considered soft and not hard scientific enough. And so it would be like I would actually be climbing uphill if I did this kind of research in that setting.
Yeah.
So I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a first-hand perspective of being in both environments.
I apologize for all the other, for the recency effect that you get the questions because you're the most recent one. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I don't know what are the solutions, but definitely, for example, what you're saying, the travel costs and this kind of stuff, that can be, but the only way you can actually intervene is to measure a bit what's going on, right? To say that in 3 years' time your weirdness went down because of sponsorship or scholarship that you're giving to certain countries, I think that would be a measurable way to say we are on the right track. And sometimes if we don't measure it, we don't know. So but for example, age, gender is not measured by weirdness, right? Which is totally missing. So it's totally an incomplete way of measuring.
Thank you.
Thank you. So perhaps before we wrap up, I have 2 questions for all our speakers. So all the presentations in this session were about representation and either about representation or about how well we conceptualize, right, some of the issues that are core to our community. So I want to ask each of you if you can kind of say quickly if you will be one thing that you will improve, or perhaps one priority for you to improve in terms of representation, right, in our community, and perhaps one other issue that you think is still poorly conceptualized in our community.